The Stellar Crossroads wasn't just a bar. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of chaos and possibility, floating in the endless black of space like a bubble of madness. Located on Omega 9, a neutral trading station that existed somewhere between civilization and complete lawlessness, the bar was a place where stories began and ended with equal frequency. Jae-hwan worked as a maintenance technician on the station. Tonight, he was off duty, wearing his simple gray jumpsuit and nursing a bright blue drink that glowed softly in the dim lighting. He had seen many things in his 5 years working on Omega 9, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. The bar was packed. Beings from 100 different planets filled every corner. Some had skin like polished metal. Others looked like walking plants or cloud-like formations that could barely hold a solid shape. In one corner, a group of silicon-based life forms communicated through complex light patterns. Near the entrance, a trio of insectoid creatures clicked and chirped in a language no human translator had ever fully decoded. And then there were the Krell. They weren't just big, they were massive. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, the Krell looked like something that had crawled out of a prehistoric nightmare and learned how to wear armor. Their scales were the color of old rust, layered like living armor. Each warrior carried weapons that looked more like small vehicles than handheld devices. When they moved, the floor seemed to shake. David sat alone at a corner table. He wasn't particularly impressive by human standards. Average height, average build. Nothing about him suggested he was anything special. He wore simple clothes, a dark jacket, worn jeans, and boots that had seen better days. His hair was cut short, and he looked like he could be any random worker from any random planet. But something was different about him. The Krell noticed him almost immediately. It wasn't that David was doing anything special. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he seemed completely relaxed, occasionally sipping from a plain glass of what looked like basic Earth whiskey. 3 Krell warriors approached his table. Their movement was deliberate, threatening. Each step was calculated to produce maximum intimidation. Their clawed hands rested casually near their weapon holsters. Sharp teeth gleamed in the bar's low light. "Human," the lead Krell growled. The universal translator embedded in the bar's communication system converted the deep, rumbling language into something understandable. "This section is for registered trade representatives." David didn't look up. He took another slow sip of his drink. The second Krell slammed a massive clawed hand on David's table. The impact was so hard that several nearby glasses vibrated and fell over. Liquid splashed across the floor. Nearby patrons instinctively moved back, creating a clear space around the potential conflict. "We are speaking to you, human," the Krell repeated, its voice a mixture of challenge and warning. Jae-hwan watched from his position at the bar. He had seen bar fights before. In a place like Omega 9, conflict was as common as breathing. But something felt different this time. The air itself seemed to change. It was like watching 2 different forces of nature prepare to collide. David finally looked up, and that was when everything changed. Byung-ho had worked at the Stellar Crossroads for 7 standard years. In that time, he had seen everything. Fights, deals, betrayals, alien species that most humans couldn't even imagine. He knew how to read a room better than anyone. When the Krell started to crowd David's table, Byung-ho moved. Not quickly, not with panic, but with the careful precision of someone who had stopped hundreds of potential disasters before they could begin. He was tall for a human, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. His bartender's uniform was crisp and clean, with patches showing his various certifications in intergalactic communication and conflict management. A small translation device hung from his ear, constantly filtering and adjusting languages in real time. "Sir," Byung-ho said, approaching David's table. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice trained to smooth over potential conflicts before they could explode. The Krell warriors turned their massive heads. Each one was a mountain of muscle and scale. Their eyes were like small black stones, cold and emotionless. They watched Byung-ho with a mixture of curiosity and potential violence. David continued to sit. His drink remained half full. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look scared. He looked like someone waiting for a bus, completely uninterested in the drama unfolding around him. "Perhaps you should calm down," Byung-ho continued, addressing David directly. "Avoid any unnecessary confrontation." The word hung in the air. The universal translator worked perfectly, converting Byung-ho's careful Korean into precise, emotionless standard galactic language. Every being in the bar could understand him perfectly. Jae-hwan, still sitting at the bar, watched with growing tension. He had seen Byung-ho diffuse fights before. The bartender was good at his job. Really good. But something felt different this time. The Krell warriors seemed to lean forward slightly. Their body language changed. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice if you weren't trained to read alien body language. But it was there. David finally moved. He turned his head, slowly, so slowly that it almost didn't look like movement at all. His eyes met Byung-ho's. Then they slid to the Krell warriors. Something happened. It wasn't anything physical. No one threw a punch. No weapons were drawn. But the temperature in the bar seemed to drop. The background noise, the constant hum of alien conversations, the soft electronic music, the distant hum of the station's life support systems, all seemed to fade away. The Krell warriors took a tiny step back. Just a tiny step. But in the complex social dynamics of galactic interactions, that step meant everything. Byung-ho felt it too. Something was wrong. His training told him to keep talking, to keep the situation calm. But for the first time in 7 years, his voice caught in his throat. "Sir," he repeated, but this time it came out more like a question than a statement. David smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't threatening. It was just a small curve of the lips, the kind of smile someone might make when they find something mildly amusing. But to the Krell warriors, it was something else entirely. Their massive bodies went completely still. The complex muscles beneath their scaled skin seemed to freeze. Their breathing changed. Something deep in their evolutionary memory was screaming a warning that their conscious minds couldn't understand. "Run," something said. "Just run." Byung-ho took a step back. His professional calm was starting to crack. He had seen many things in this bar. Fights between species that humans couldn't even imagine. Negotiations that could determine the fate of entire star systems. But he had never seen anything like this. The stellar crossroads, which had witnessed countless conflicts and negotiations, seemed to hold its breath. And David just sat there, smiling that small, quiet smile. Time seemed to slow down in the stellar crossroads. The lead Krell warrior was named Kraz. He had fought in 17 different star system conflicts. He had crushed entire planetary resistance movements. His body was a map of battle scars, each one telling a story of victory and violence. But right now, Kraz was confused. David's simple words echoed through the bar. "Calm down," he repeated. His voice was soft, quiet, but something in those words made everyone stop. The universal translator worked perfectly. It converted David's words with complete accuracy. But something extra came through, something that couldn't be explained by technology. Jae-hwan felt it first. A tiny tremor ran down his spine. He had worked on space stations for years. He knew how to read tension. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The bar's lighting seemed to change, not physically, but in the way people perceived it. Shadows moved differently. Colors looked slightly off. Kraz leaned forward. His massive body blocked out light. His breath smelled of chemical warfare stimulants and ancient rage. Most beings would have been terrified. Most beings would have broken. David didn't move. He just looked at Kraz. Simple eye contact. Nothing more. But in that look, something happened. The Krell warriors had a complex biological system. Their brains processed threat differently from humans. They had evolved on a planet where everything was a potential enemy, where survival meant constant aggression, where showing weakness meant death. Their neural pathways were designed for war, for conquest, for violence. But human psychology was different. Humans had survived by being unpredictable, by understanding group dynamics, by communicating threats in ways that went beyond physical size or weaponry. David represented something the Krell had never encountered. Complete, absolute, calm. Kraz took another step forward. His clawed hand moved towards a weapon. A standard-issue plasma cutter that could slice through metal walls. A weapon that had ended countless lives across multiple star systems. But his hand was shaking. Just a little. But it was shaking. Byung-ho watched in total silence. His translator was working perfectly. But for the first time in his career, he realized that language was more than just words. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. The other bar patrons started to move. Slowly, carefully. Some were sliding towards exits. Others were freezing in place. Alien species with completely different biological structures were all responding the same way. They were getting out of the way. Not because of any visible threat, not because of any obvious danger, but because something was happening, something that went beyond normal understanding. David continued to sit. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't stand up. He didn't do anything threatening. He just existed. And in that existence, he was more terrifying than any weapon. Kraz's second-in-command, a battle-hardened warrior named Zex, took a small step back, then another. His training screamed at him to attack. His entire evolutionary history demanded aggression. But something else was speaking louder, a deep primal warning. Run, it said. Just run. The bar's background systems continued to hum. Distant station announcements continued. Somewhere, a maintenance robot was cleaning a far corner. Life continued. But in this moment, everything had changed. David smiled. Just a small smile. But it was enough. Movement happened slowly. David stood up. It wasn't a quick action. It wasn't dramatic. He simply shifted his weight, pushed back his chair, and rose to his full height. In any other context, it would have been unremarkable. But not here. Not now. The stellar crossroads had seen thousands of species, hundreds of thousands of interactions, but nobody had ever seen anything quite like this. David was average in every way. About 6 feet tall, normal build, plain clothes, the kind of person you would never notice in a crowd, the type of human that would blend into any background on any planet. But when he stood, something changed. Kraz, the lead Krell warrior, had fought in 17 different galactic conflicts. He had crushed planetary rebellions, ended entire civilizations' hopes in single battles. His body was a map of scars, each telling a story of brutal victory. But right now, Kraz was feeling something he had never felt before. Fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from physical threat. Not the fear of potential injury or death. This was something deeper, something more fundamental. The kind of fear that lives in the oldest parts of a creature's brain. Jahuan, still sitting at the bar, noticed how the light seemed to change. Not physically, but in the way everyone perceived it. Shadows moved differently. Colors looked slightly off. Other bar patrons started to move. Slowly, carefully. Some slid towards exits. Others froze in place. Alien species with completely different biological structures were all responding the same way. They were getting out of the way. Byung-ho, the bartender, had seen many things in 7 years of work. Fights between species humans couldn't even imagine. Negotiations that could determine the fate of entire star systems. But he had never seen anything like this. David didn't do anything special. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't make any threatening movements. He simply stood. And in that standing, he communicated something that went beyond words. The Krell warriors were biological machines of war. Their entire evolutionary path was built on aggression, on dominance, on crushing anything that showed weakness. But humans were different. Humans had survived by being unpredictable, by understanding group dynamics in ways that went beyond simple physical threat. David represented something the Krell had never encountered. Complete, absolute, calm. Zex, Kraz's second-in-command, took a step back, then another. His entire training screamed at him to attack. His evolutionary history demanded aggression. But something else was speaking louder, a deep primal warning. Run, it said. Just run. The bar's background systems continued to hum. Distant station announcements played softly. Somewhere, a maintenance robot cleaned a far corner. Life continued. But in this moment, everything had changed. The universal translator worked perfectly. But for the first time, everyone realized that communication was more than just words. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. David's eyes moved across the Krell warriors. No anger, no threat, just a simple, calm observation. And in that observation, he was more terrifying than any weapon. Kraz's massive body seemed to shrink. His clawed hand, which moments ago had been reaching for a plasma cutter, now hung limply at his side. The other Krell warriors did something they had never done in any recorded conflict. They took a collective step back, not because of any visible threat, not because of any obvious danger, but because something was happening that went beyond their understanding. David just stood there, calm, waiting. And in that waiting, he communicated more than words ever could. The entire bar held its breath. Something was about to happen, but nobody knew exactly what. Something broke inside the Krell warriors, not physically, not in a way that could be seen with normal eyes, but deep inside their complicated brain structures, something fundamental changed. The witnesses would later struggle to explain what happened. Dozens of different species would give dozens of different accounts, but they all agreed on one thing. Something impossible had occurred. Kraz, the lead Krell warrior, was the first to show it. His massive body started to shake, not with anger, not with fear, but with something else entirely. A small sound came out of his throat. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a war cry. It was something between a whimper and a gasp. The universal translator took a moment to process the sound. When it did, the entire bar heard the translation. No, Kraz said softly. No. Zex, his second-in-command, dropped his weapon. The plasma cutter hit the floor with a loud metal clang. It was a weapon that had ended entire planetary conflicts, a tool of destruction that represented generations of Krell military might. And now it lay on the floor, forgotten. Jaewon watched from the bar. His hands gripped his drink so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had seen many things in his years working on space stations, but nothing like this. David hadn't moved. He was still standing, still calm. The other bar patrons were frozen. Alien species with completely different biological structures were all responding the same way. Some were moving towards exits. Others were completely still. Byung-ho, the bartender, felt something change in the air. It wasn't something you could measure, not with any known scientific instrument, but it was there. The Krell had a complex history. They had conquered 17 star systems, crushed countless planetary rebellions. Their entire culture was built on the idea of absolute dominance. But humans were different. Humans survived by being unpredictable, by understanding group dynamics in ways that went beyond simple physical threat. And David represented something the Krell had never encountered. Complete, absolute, calm. One of the younger Krell warriors, a rookie named Vex, began to cry. Not with tears like humans would cry, but with a deep, rumbling sound that came from somewhere deep inside. The sound was terror. Pure, absolute terror. Kraz took another step back. His massive body seemed to shrink. The scars that told stories of past victories now looked like marks of weakness. The universal translator worked perfectly. But for the first time, everyone realized that communication was more than just words. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. David's eyes moved across the Krell warriors. No anger, no threat, just a simple, calm observation. And in that observation, he was more terrifying than any weapon. The bar's background systems continued to hum. Distant station announcements played softly. Somewhere, a maintenance robot cleaned a far corner. Life continued. But in this moment, everything had changed. Zex began to speak. His voice was different now. Broken. Confused. "We don't understand," he said. The translation was perfect. But the emotion behind it was something new. Humans had always been seen as a young species, newcomers to the galactic stage, not particularly impressive in technology, not especially strong. But something else was happening here. David represented a type of threat that went beyond physical strength, a threat of understanding, a threat of potential. The Krell warriors were biological machines of war. Their entire evolutionary path was built on aggression, on dominance, on crushing anything that showed weakness. But David showed them something else. The potential for something they had never considered. The ability to simply exist. Calm. Unafraid. Completely in control. Kraz looked at David, not with anger, not with hate, but with something that looked almost like respect. The entire bar held its breath. Something had changed, and nobody knew exactly what. News travels fast in space, but this news traveled faster than light. Within minutes, the incident at the stellar crossroads became more than just a bar fight. It became a message, a signal, something that would change everything. The first communication came from Omega 9's Central Communication Hub, a simple video recording. 12 minutes of footage showing David standing, the Krell warriors falling apart. Complete silence except for background station noise. Diplomatic channels lit up like burning stars. The Krell Galactic Command received the report first. They didn't believe it. How could they? Their entire culture was built on the idea of absolute dominance, of never showing weakness. Admiral Krelltok reviewed the footage. He had fought in more conflicts than most species had years of history. His body was a living weapon. His mind was a strategic computer. But when he watched the video, something changed. "Replay," he said 3 times. Each time, the same result. The transmission went out to 17 different star systems, encrypted, secured. But somehow it leaked. It always leaks. Jahuan, who had been there that night, was immediately taken for questioning. Not by station security, not by local authorities, but by beings he had never seen before. They were tall, thin, wearing uniforms that seemed to shift colors when you looked directly at them. "Tell us exactly what happened," they said. But Jahuan couldn't explain it. Nobody could. Byung-ho was next, the bartender who had spoken those fateful words. "Calm down," he had said. Simple words, words that would now be studied by multiple species. Xenopsychologists would spend years analyzing those moments. What had happened? How had it happened? Why had it happened? The Krell Galactic Command called an emergency meeting. 17 different planetary representatives gathered. Some physically, some through advanced holographic projection. "We cannot explain it," Admiral Krelltok said. The room went silent. A single human, standing, doing nothing, had broken something fundamental in the most aggressive species in known space. Communication reports began to flood in. The Krell warriors who had been in the bar were completely changed. They refused to fight. They refused to train. They sat. They looked. They remembered. David was nowhere to be found. Station records showed he had arrived on a standard passenger transport. No special permissions. No unusual background. Just another human traveling through space. But now everything was different. The stellar crossroads became a place of pilgrimage. Species from across known space came to stand in the exact spot where David had stood, to try and understand. Nobody could explain what had happened, but everyone knew something had changed. The Krell, who had conquered 17 star systems, who had crushed countless rebellions, who had never known fear, were now something else. Broken, confused, aware. Diplomatic protocols were rewritten. Travel restrictions were implemented. Entire communication systems were redesigned. All because of 12 minutes. All because of one human. All because of a simple standing. No weapons had been used. No advanced technology deployed. Just a human. Standing. Calm. The universe looked different now. And nobody knew why. But everyone knew one thing. Humans were not what they seemed. Not anymore. The Intergalactic Council met in emergency session. They gathered in a massive room that floated between star systems. No single planet could host such a meeting. The room itself was a marvel of technology, shifting, changing, adapting to the needs of different species. 53 different species represented, each with their own way of communication. Some spoke, some used light patterns, some communicated through complex chemical exchanges. But today, they all talked about one thing: humans. Dr. Elena Rodriguez sat in the human delegation. She was not their leader. She was not their most important representative. She was simply there. But her presence meant everything. "We cannot classify humans as we did before," said Ketal, the Rigelian representative. His body was made of living crystal that shifted colors when he spoke. Something has changed. The Krell incident was more than just a bar fight now. It was a fundamental shift in galactic understanding. Humans had always been seen as a young species, new to space travel, not particularly advanced, not especially strong. But now everything was different. The video from the stellar crossroads played again. Dagged standing. The Krell warriors falling apart. Complete silence. 12 minutes that changed everything. Potential existential threat. Read the new classification. Not because of weapons, not because of technology, but because of something deeper. The ability to communicate threat in ways no one understood. The Zorn representatives, beings of pure energy, were especially concerned. They could read emotional states. They could sense psychological pressure. And what they sensed from humans terrified them. "They do not fight," said the Zorn leader. "They make others stop fighting." Diplomatic protocols were rewritten. Travel restrictions were implemented. Entire communication systems were redesigned. The Krell, who had conquered 17 star systems, were now something else. Broken. Confused. Aware. Intelligence reports flooded in. Humans who had previously been ignored were now watched carefully. Every interaction became a potential study. What made humans different? The council spent hours discussing this. Scientists, diplomats, military leaders, each bringing their own perspective. Dr. Rodriguez said very little. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. The Rigelian representative's crystal body shifted through multiple colors, a sign of deep confusion and concern. "We need to understand," Ketal said. "We need to know what happened." But nobody could explain it. Not really. A human standing, doing nothing, had broken something fundamental in the most aggressive species in known space. The classification was clear. Humans. Potential EXISTENTIAL3. 3AT Leviel. Unknown. RECOMMENDHION. Care Fuel OBSARVHON. Entire departments were created. Entire research facilities built. All to study one simple question. What made humans so different? The Intergalactic Council did not make decisions quickly. They did not make them easily. But this time, the decision was unanimous. Humans were not what they seemed, and everyone needed to be careful. Very careful. The meeting ended, but the questions remained. Who was David? What had he done? And most importantly, could it happen again? Nobody knew, but everyone was watching, waiting. Dr. Min Seo Park sat in her research laboratory. Walls covered with screens, holographic images floating everywhere. Each image showed a different moment from the stellar crossroads incident. She had been studying human psychology for 23 years, but this was different. This was something new. What makes humans unique? She whispered to herself. The video played again. David standing. The Krell warriors falling apart. 12 minutes that changed everything. Her team was special. 50 researchers from 18 different species, the best minds in the galaxy, all focused on one question. Understanding humans. It's not about physical threat, Dr. Park told her team. It's about something deeper. The research facility was located on a neutral space station, floating between star systems, completely isolated, completely secure. Massive computer systems analyzed every single moment of the video, frame by frame, millisecond by millisecond. They found nothing and everything. David's body language was completely normal. His breathing, his muscle tension, everything was average. But something was different. The Krell warriors had a complex biological system. Their brains processed threat differently from humans. They had evolved on a planet where everything was a potential enemy. Survival meant constant aggression. Humans were different. Humans survived by being unpredictable, by understanding group dynamics in ways that went beyond simple physical threat. Look at his eyes, Dr. Park said. The team watched again. David's eyes did nothing special. They moved. They looked. They observed. But something was there. A type of communication that went beyond words, beyond physical threat, beyond understanding. Psychological profiles were created, analyzed, discarded, created again. Who was David? Where did he come from? What made him different? Station records showed nothing special. A standard human. Average background. No military training. No special skills. Just another person traveling through space. But something was different. The Zorn representatives, beings of pure energy who could read emotional states, were brought in to help. There is something, they said. Something we cannot measure. Entire research departments were created. Massive funding allocated. The most advanced technology in the galaxy focused on one simple question. What made humans so different? Dr. Park's team worked around the clock. They did not sleep. They did not rest. They watched. They analyzed. They tried to understand. Psychological profiles were compared. Evolutionary histories examined. Every single detail studied. The Krell warriors who had been in the bar were brought in for study. They were different now. Change. Something fundamental had broken inside them. We don't understand, they said. The universal translator worked perfectly. But the emotion behind the words was something new. Fear. Confusion. Awareness. Dr. Park knew something important. Something fundamental had changed. Humans were not what they seemed. Not anymore. The research continued. The questions remained. Who was David? What had he done? And most importantly, could it happen again? Nobody knew. But everyone was watching. Waiting. Studying. The universe looked different now, and no one could explain why. 5 years after the incident, everything had changed. The Stellar Crossroads Bar was now a museum. Preserved exactly as it was that night, visitors from across the galaxy came to see the place where everything shifted. Telling a human to calm down became a restricted communication protocol. Jae-won worked as a security consultant now. He had been one of the few witnesses that night. People still asked him about what happened, but he could never explain it fully. It was just a moment, he would say. Just 12 minutes that changed everything. David remained a mystery. No records could be found. No background checks revealed anything special. It was like he had appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as quickly. The Krell were different now. Their entire culture had transformed. The most aggressive species in the galaxy had become something else. Something softer. Something more aware. Military academies were shut down. Entire planetary defense systems were redesigned. All because of one human. Standing. doing nothing. Byung-ho, the bartender who had spoken those first words, became a celebrity of sorts. Interviews, research studies, diplomatic conferences, everyone wanted to know what he had seen. But he could never explain it properly. David just stood there, he would say. And something changed. The Intergalactic Council had created entire departments to study human psychology, massive research facilities, unlimited funding, the best minds from 53 different species, all trying to understand one simple thing. What made humans so different? Dr. Min Seo Park continued her research. Her team had analyzed every single moment of the 12-minute video thousands of times. Computer systems more powerful than entire planets had studied every millisecond. They found nothing and everything. Diplomatic protocols were completely rewritten, travel restrictions implemented, communication systems redesigned. Humans were now classified as a potential existential threat, not because of weapons, not because of technology, but because of something deeper. The ability to communicate threat in ways no one understood. The Zorn representatives, beings of pure energy who could read emotional states, remained terrified. They could sense something in humans that went beyond physical reality. They do not fight, they would say. They make others stop fighting. Museums were created, research centers established. Entire academic fields emerged to study that single moment. The 12 minutes that changed everything. Some people started to worship David, not as a hero, not as a leader, but as a symbol of something larger. The power of simply existing, of being calm, of showing no threat, and yet communicating everything. Conspiracy theories emerged. Some said David was a secret weapon. Others claimed he was an alien in human form. Some believed he was a message from another dimension. The truth remained unknown, but everyone agreed on one thing. Humans were not what they seemed. Not anymore. The bar where it happened remained exactly the same. The chair where David sat. The spot where he stood. The exact location of the Krell warriors. Preserved. Studied. Remembered. People would come from across the galaxy to stand in that spot, to try and understand, to feel what happened that night. But nobody could explain it. Not really. A human standing, doing nothing, had broken something fundamental in the most aggressive species in known space, and everything was different now. Very different. Some say that on quiet nights, if you listen carefully in certain space stations, you might hear a bartender whispering a warning. Whatever you do, just don't tell the human to calm down.